Hi everybody, we've got 21 attendees so far, so I'm going to make a start. Welcome to the 5th of our Walk in My Shoes web series, where we are today looking at another 3 weeks of lockdown, where the uncertainty of the future is still in the forefront of all of our minds. And today we hope to bring you a short distraction, potentially some peace, while we look at what's possible for the future. Today we are looking at the responses of both the UK and the US to the pandemic, and I would like to welcome back Alana Petraske from With Us Worldwide, who will be facilitating the discussion today. And joining her is Ted Hart of CAF America, Sarah Farrow of Hirth, and it was supposed to be philanthropist Grant Gordon, but he's been held up. Hopefully he'll join us. Oh, here he is, just as I'm introducing him. He arrived.
Wonderful.
Hi, Grant.
Hello.
I was just introducing you then. Where have you gone? Hello.
We've started now.
Hello, John.
All right.
So the chat is open for questions. Please do use it, interact. The more we make this interactive, the more fun, the more lively the discussion can be. And afterwards, there is a group on LinkedIn that you can join where you can ask questions if you haven't been able to today. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you to the panelists. I will now hand over to the lovely Alana.
Sorry, Sophia, just one more thing. Also, this with all the others goes on YouTube. We have our own YouTube page now.
Okay.
Alana, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sophia and John. And thank you especially to Ted and Sarah and Grant for participating. This is there we go. Hello, Grant. This is, not as great as sitting down with you all face to face, but it's a really, really great second best in my view. So I'm really glad to be participating myself. Dialing in today from New York. After my 19 years in the UK, I'm now based in New York. So definitely the US perspective here. We've got 28 remaining minutes, so I'm gonna, which I like short and sweet, and I like your approach there, John and Sophia, with having a short session. So we'll try and keep it to time and get the perspective of all of our interesting panelists today. I would just love to have a couple of seconds of check-in with each of you, though, to see how this crisis is affecting you and your professional and personal situations, or what sorts of things your clients are bringing to you particularly, sort of just general and short check-in there. Grant, I'd love to start with you. How are you doing? Where are you, and how is this crisis affecting you? High level.
Hello, Alana. Hi, hello to New York. Sitting here in London, sitting here confined at home in London, the center of London. I think what we're seeing and what I'm seeing is through the philanthropy, the work I'm doing, particularly chairing the Childhood Trust and operating charity here in London, seeing huge challenges for the charities we're working with around service delivery, adapting, and then looking forward, thinking about how those charities are going to how they're going to be able to recover from the immediate crisis and then rebuild resilience as we move forward into the second half of the year. So that's sort of the top line, is a lot of challenges, very, very, very difficult circumstances for a lot of charities, particularly in the child poverty sector where we are most involved as a funder.
Wonderful. Ted, can I turn to you? How does this crisis affecting you, and where do we find you today?
I'm in Washington, D.C. Thank you for having me here today. Extremely busy. Philanthropists are stepping up to make a difference in COVID relief. CAF America's expertise, of course, as you know, is international funding. On our website, we now have over 205 charities that are fully vetted and regulatory compliant for a grant or COVID-19 relief on the ground in 41 countries. We are funding all of those and, of course, validating additional charities as we're able to identify those. They're providing direct relief. What we're hearing from philanthropists is really the urgency of now, wanting to make a difference and wanting money to get to those in need and communities in need as quickly as possible.
Wonderful, wonderful. Sarah, how are you being affected, you and your clients, and where do we find you this today?
So I'm at home in Surrey. From a business perspective, obviously the big change is obviously we're all working from home rather than in our office in London. And our clients really are a mixture of kind of business entrepreneurs or wealthy individuals. And I think the business clients in particular, you know, are worried at the moment about how long the lockdown's going. Some of those are able to operate from home, but some of them are kind of service industry type businesses, or businesses that have had to shut down overnight, and that uncertainty and that lack of cash flow is obviously a big concern for people in those kind of industries.
Wonderful. The US and the UK are often compared in a philanthropic context. I love to avoid these comparisons myself, but it's inevitable. The US is, perhaps known to be the most generous country, but also, of course, has been one of the least generous in terms of social provision from government. So there's a lot of history and complexity to levels of giving. But there often is, at times of crisis, there is a question, a sort of soul-searching question that I recall from UK discussions about what should we be doing, and do UK philanthropists need to do more? I will say, from a US perspective, that's a discussion that's happening here too. So it's not unique to the UK. But Grant, I'd love to. We're so grateful to have the philanthropic perspective here. What do you think? Is there a moral imperative here for giving in terms of responding to this crisis?
I think definitely. I think there absolutely is. I think we've got a wonderful example of that. Our centenarian Tom, the Captain Tom in Yorkshire, and you can see the outpouring of support, in that appeal. The captain who walked his 100 times around his garden, raising 25 million. So I think it's really this crisis is touching on the souls, and the sort of touching on people's people's recognition that we're all in this crisis together. And so there's a response that we're beginning to see from the public, and that's right across the spectrum. So I think that there definitely is that. And that's a very strong, there's very strong reasons, and we're seeing that not just in the general public, but also in some of the leading philanthropies and the leading funders, and even in the government too. And the government now recognizing the need, the pressure on charities are estimated to lose about £4 billion of funding in the UK. So the government's stepping in to the tune of about 800 million already. So those. Yes, I'm sure other speakers have other perspectives to add.
Sarah, are you hearing clients who are philanthropically minded? Are you hearing them talk about, now is the time to give back, or are they getting in touch to talk about giving now? Is that something you see in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think that normally we tend to see people's donations when they file their tax returns, so after the event. But I know this is a time when our more philanthropic clients will be thinking about this, and also it will potentially change their behaviour in terms of the type of giving and who they're giving to. I think that it's easy to look further afield to different other countries and help other countries or other individuals outside their own kind of area, whilst they're in a relatively calm, stable type environment themselves. But I think when something like this happens and they can see vulnerable people in their neighborhood, that kind of thing, people kind of refocus their attention. And I think going back to something Grant said about Captain Tom, I mean, had he done his 100 walks around his garden at any other time of the year raising money for the NHS, I don't think that he would have got the kind of support he has. But at the moment, people are, they're responding to the kind of crisis around them by wanting to support things more kind of locally. And so things like the NHS type charities are the kind of charities that people are focusing on now in terms of their giving at the moment.
Interesting. Ted, I know you are, I'm sure, seeing local interest from donors, but I think you're also probably seeing a lot of donors who are interested in benefiting causes that are outside the US, and so coming to you to help them with cross-border philanthropy at this time. Tell us a little bit about how CAF America is able to help with that situation. And I know listeners will probably be interested to hear a little bit about the CARES Act incentive that has been introduced this year, because it is very unique.
Thank you, Alana. Yes, so we're seeing a very broad outpouring of philanthropic support here in the United States. Certainly, there is a lot of interest in giving to communities that have been affected, very obviously affected around the world. But what we're interested to see with a lot of the corporations that we work with is that they're also looking at charities that they have traditionally funded and are reaching out to determine the effect that they have had and the stress that they are under and the other funding that might not be coming to them. So a number of our donors are actually accelerating grants to charities that are not providing direct COVID relief, but are under stress themselves. They have lost staff members or are not able to work as they have in the past. So we're very pleased to see an interest in keeping the philanthropic sector itself strong, in addition to reaching out and finding new dollars for communities that are directly in need. You mentioned the CARES Act, which was the third funding bill that was passed by Congress and signed by the president here in the United States. The CARES Act itself had some very generous provisions for donors here in the United States, specifically for individuals who in the year 2020 can now make contributions and deduct 100% of their giving. So this is certainly a year, and certainly Congress has stepped forward to say, yes, the U.S. is historically generous in giving, but we need philanthropists to be even more generous. For corporations now, instead of just being able to deduct 10%, they're now able to deduct 25% if they give in 2020. And this is across the board to any kind of charity. The only restriction is that they cannot give through a donor advised fund. They must give in a restricted way directly to support the charity of their interest. So Congress has stepped up to provide funding directly to Americans and to corporations. They've now stepped up to enhance the deductibility of giving from individuals and corporations. And we're seeing philanthropists give around the world and here right in the United States, both to charities that they've traditionally supported, but also to charities that are providing direct support for COVID relief.
And I think this point about keeping funding going or accelerating it or even growing it to even charities that are not providing direct COVID responsive services is so important. The US and the UK perhaps will be some of the most badly hit countries when this crisis bears itself out in due course. And we are some of the countries that have the most robust giving and philanthropic traditions. There's a bit of an irony there, but we must have our civil society institutions in future. We must take care of those organizations we'd like to see existing at the end of this. So there's great arguments, I think, for funders to continue with funding, the community kindergarten or, the theater.
That's right.
I'm interested, Ted has raised this, the CARES Act incentive, and from a UK perspective, I think it's very interesting. We obviously with Gift Aid don't have a cap. We famously almost had a cap several years ago, but we didn't. And so in principle, UK donors are able to give away the whole of their income if they want and mitigate their tax. But it's an interesting point of discussion. Is there a way that tax incentives could be pushing people to do more giving in the UK? The US has a different mechanism than the UK does, but clearly there has been a desire to push people to give by making it more attractive, fiscally attractive for them to do so. It's challenging to think of a way that might work in the UK, but I don't know. Grant or Sarah, do you have any views about in whether there's a role to play to incentivize donors from a sort of tax or government perspective?
I mean, I do think that, as you've already said, that we do offer good relief for charitable donations at the moment in the UK already. I think where we differ though from the US is the US is much more flexible in terms of what you can give to charity. In the UK, you can give cash to charity under the gift aid scheme, or you can give quoted investments or property to a charity, but you can't give anything else. The US is much more relaxed in terms of what you can give, so they make it easier from that perspective. And I think also the gift aid scheme, it kind of is a bit clunky compared to the US system of a kind of a straight deduction, in terms of you have to work out, you give the net amount, you get a deduction for the gross amount, the charity claims some back from the government. In terms of gift aid, it seems a much more kind of clunky system, and a more straightforward straight deduction system I think would be easier for people to understand. I get lots of people who say, well, what relief am I going to get on this gift? And when you sort of tell them the tax amount, they're like, well, that doesn't work out. And you have to say, yeah, but the amount you're giving isn't the gross amount. You have to gross it up, and then they get some back this way. And so it can be difficult for people to understand and see what's actually going to the charity, rather than just making a gift and knowing that you've given that amount to a charity. So, I mean, I think the system, and also I think in the US, everyone files a return, so everybody puts their claims for their deductions in. In the UK, not everybody files a tax return, and so for those people, claiming gift aid is more difficult, in that you then have to, if you've got coding notices, have to phone up HMRC and get your donations added to your coding notice. It's just, it seems like a much more, as I've said, clunky system maybe than the US in terms of getting relief for your donations.
Grant, do you think some of our high net worth donors in the UK would be incentivized to give more in this circumstance, or are they already just motivated by their moral imperative, and tax incentives wouldn't necessarily add anything to that?
I think you have to go with the moral incentive being the primary, but the secondary. I mean, looking at from a philanthropist perspective, I think the US system is far superior. And it really, the incentive is more driven towards the philanthropist, sucking more money into the sector, whereas the UK system is sort of all kind of, it seems to sort of try and be looking to drive the incentive into the charities. I think the whole sector would be better off if the incentive was straight to the donor, and that, you increase the incentive at donor level to step up and give more money.
It's certainly, there is so much on the mind of government, no doubt, in trying to address various things going on with the crisis, not least bailout packages, et cetera. But I personally would be curious to see if there's appetite for more creativity around temporary incentivization of the sort the US is doing. One challenge, of course, which is common at all times, is the way it might be perceived by some parts of the public and in the press. So, what would be disastrous, I think, for us would be for the government to do a temporary full deduction scenario for people making substantial gifts. I can see that being portrayed negatively in the press. So it's a challenging circumstance.
Alana, sorry.
Yes.
Alana, there's another issue tied to this as well. I mean, if you look at the wealthy people in this country, for example, less than 10% of the donations for high net worth and ultra high net worth comes from those people. And the average, or the sort of the medium gift, which was for under 500 pounds, is now around 4,000, so it's an improvement. But it still means that half of the wealthiest people are giving less than 4,000. So there is an issue about how we incentivize people to give more and get more involved. And I think tax is one thing, but there's cultural issues and other issues as well. I think the Beacon report just that came out talks about some of these barriers to giving.
Thank you for that, John. Grant, you were involved, I think, in the Beacon report in some way. I mean, there are so many different cultural pieces that go into this. I don't know if you have ones that you would like to pull out for conversation here. For me, the issues about having enough, so sufficiency and scarcity, I think are very profound levers of giving, when people feel able to give, in other words. Is there anything from the Beacon report you'd love to pull out there, Grant, or anyone?
I think the bit that I would like to sort of just hone in on is the trust between donors and the non-profit sector, or the charity sector, as we call it here in the UK. I think that's a big issue, but I think now there's an opportunity really for people to look at that issue and see how the role of larger sort of these larger campaigns that have been mobilized around COVID-19. So I'm thinking of things like, you know, the National Emergency Trust and the role it's playing in terms of delivering resources. I'm thinking about some donor advised funds, some of the bigger ones that are positioned to help donors sort of channel their money, because this issue of trust is important. And for those, you know, who are, hopefully there'll be a lot of people thinking about stepping up their giving at this point in time. And I think this is a good question for them to ask, you know, should we just give our money to these trusted and these funnels, if you like, these channels of driving philanthropy out into where the need is, and letting really the experts, if you like, get on with that sort of due diligence and making sure that the money is going to sort of really achieve the social benefit and the investment is there for.
Is there any one thing, just sorry, sticking with you, Grant, for a second, is there any one thing that could help the wealthiest in the UK step up and give more at this time? I mean, obviously it's a wider question for general times, but in relation to this crisis, is there anything we need to do to unblock that? I mean, maybe that's the £1 million question, isn't it?
John talked about culture before, but I think this is a time when all of us need to go out and talk about, you know, those of us who are in there and actually doing things. I think now's the time to share our stories, to share our experiences, to show, you know, to be open and be transparent about what we're doing. I think if we can do that, I think there's some great examples out there. You know, you see people like the Indigo Trust, Van Perrin, and so on, and you see some wonderful leaders, philanthropy leaders, like you have in North America too. So I think look to others around you and talk to others around you about what they're feeling about it. That would be one idea.
Wonderful. Ted, we just had a mention of donor advised funds, and I think apart from the cross-border sort of facilitation that you're able to do under the CARES Act for donors, there's a great role, isn't there, right now for donor advised funds to play. That, you know, they are in many cases a pot of monies that are already devoted to charitable purposes, and so even in times of uncertainty for donors, when they may be worried about their own and their family's position, that money is there and they've already given it. Is there, are you seeing that, first of all, on the donor advised fund side of CAF's operations?
We are, and I think that is one of the true benefits of donor advised funds for, you know, all of the sort of naysayers that there might be, is that over the last several years, donor advised funds have grown tremendously, and there are large pots of money. Those donors who may themselves now be at risk have the ability to now advise those funds to areas of greatest needs, and in fact, they're doing that, and I think that's really terrific. It was also mentioned the role of tax incentives. And in the United States, there have been many studies that have shown that people don't give for the tax relief. However, it does often affect how much they give. And we saw that played out here in the United States, in that Congress changed the incentives for particularly low and middle income Americans who have always been able to receive that tax relief. But what we call the standard deduction was doubled, essentially removing the incentive for most Americans of modest means to make a charitable deduction. We saw that in the numbers last year. The last last report, $428 billion was donated in the United States. But when you account for inflation, that was down by 2%. And that, I think, did have a lot to do with the tax change in 2017. I bring that up because in this CARES Act, Congress, I think, recognized that. So they created a whole new deduction that is above the standard deduction that allows every American, regardless of their means, to deduct at least $300. And so it's a brand new deduction that I think everyone can now give $300 and fully deduct that from their taxes. So I think allowing those of modest means to give and those of great means to give is a wonderful balance that we're seeing in the incentives that are being put forward for COVID relief.
Alana, there's a question that's come through the chat. May I ask it of you?
Yes, I just realized that the this panel now shows the questions, and sorry for anyone whose I've disregarded, but are you going to, is it the last one about resiliency? Because that's the one I have just noted and I think is very interesting.
Yes, go ahead and ask it. Read it there.
Yes, so our participant Heiko Specking, who some of you may know, hello, has asked a wonderful question, I think, which is how should philanthropic money today be directed towards the rebuild of systems once we exit, particularly to try and create more resiliency in the system? I don't know if everyone can see that question or if it's just me, but there's a little bit more to it, including to mention climate change. But this strikes me as such an important question to ask ourselves. Right now, I feel like maybe we're all scrambling to try and go back to as it was, you know, rather than perhaps seeing this as an opportunity to think about what it should be, our system. So what do you think? Is there can we look towards a new, more resilient world if we rebuild properly? Complicated question. Anyone? Grant?
May I jump in? I want to go, I like that question. I think it's so important. I think, so I was on a webinar last week. I was listening to Anthony Bug-Levine, you guys in the States know him very well, talking about resilience going forward for charities. I think when you're a funder, you need to ask the question, you know, should you be restricting the funds you give to charities to specific programs? I think now is the time that we need to really ask the question about unrestricted funding. Charities are hobbled, the nonprofits are hobbled the world over at the moment because their reserves are absolutely wafer thin. And the reason the reserves are wafer thin is that funders have been funding them on the basis of restricted funding for programs. So I think now's the time to be asking the question about whether that strategy, that funding strategy, is appropriate in the future. And I think if you look at London funders, which you look at the principles they set out, which have now been endorsed as well by the European Foundation Centre, you know, at the heart of that is, you know, thinking about unrestricted funding.
Wonderful. And I think part of the question I didn't read out was about health systems, educational systems, and climate change, which really goes to sort of what's this, can we build a more resilient society, not just a more resilient sort of third sector. Very interesting questions here. Sarah or Ted, anything else to add to that on the resiliency point? I know we'll have an opportunity on the LinkedIn group to talk about these issues more.
I do think it's an important topic, and we are seeing funders look to more unrestricted, or at least to remove many of the impediments, including extensive reporting, understanding that a lot of nonprofit staffs right now are under stress themselves, are having trouble providing services, and are struggling to do that. Whatever burdens can be removed, I think, are wise, and I think it's a good question whether or not all those restrictions should ever return.
Go ahead, John. Yeah.
You only have 1 minute.
1 minute remaining. Yes.
But, can I just make one point? And I have a question I've been dying to ask for a long time. The role of professional advisors is really important in this whole process, and I don't want to lose that because, of course, research shows that they can influence and support their clients on their donor journey. So that's really a key thing. The other question, though, is in the U.S., there's a group called Patriotic Millionaires. And I don't know, Ted, if that group has helped you or made it more difficult, because they basically are talking about a fair tax system, guaranteed living wage, and dealing with income disparity. But they don't seem to talk anywhere about philanthropy.
Yeah, well, I think there's a time and place for anything that speaks to the political aspect of all of this. What I'm pleased is to see just how many philanthropists are focused on the urgency of now, right now, what charities are facing, what communities are facing. And I think we may look back on this and see this as one of the finest times of philanthropy around the world, not just in the United States, but we're seeing this around the world.
Great, thank you.
That's a great note to end on, John. And we've hit 11:30. Thank you so much for involving me. Thank you to all of our panelists for participating. John and Zofia, do you want to tell us a bit about how we continue to participate on the LinkedIn group? Or is it self-explanatory? I haven't done it yet. Forgive me.
Zofia.
It's the fear of children coming in, sorry. Yeah, for the LinkedIn group, I've sent an email link to everybody. It's in the chat. If you just follow that link, we'll let you join in. The questions that have already been posed will be there. Panelists, if you can, just come and have a look at them, answer them there and then if you can. And people, please pose more questions. It's for discussion. I know there's loads more for us to talk about on this. On the other, just to add that we will be looking at doing a panel discussion around the Beacon findings, the report findings, in the next few weeks. So we'll be able to go in more depth on that then as well. But thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Anna,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for doing this.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank
Bye.
you. Bye, Lana. Thank you.
Bye-bye.